everyone. I see several familiar faces on this call, so that's really, really exciting. As Carla mentioned, I'm Cordelia McGee-Tubb, pronouns she, her. I am a design technologist, which is a fancy title for someone kind of at the intersection of um, web design and web development. I'm a digital accessibility specialist and a technology tutor. So I've worked at eBay, Color, which is a health tech company, Salesforce and Dropbox, really focused on making their products more accessible for people with disabilities and for people who are aging and having their abilities change as they age. I've been a volunteer with Community Tech Network for, I want to say, 11 years now. For most of my time volunteering for Community Tech Network, I've been working at Curry Senior Center as one of their volunteer technology tutors for their senior vitality program. A moment in my career that I found really impactful in thinking about the diversity of disability and of access solutions. When I was at Dropbox, we were trying to figure out how do we make Dropbox better for people with low vision. And so we did a focus group with Lighthouse for the Blind, which you may be familiar with. We met up with, I would say, like 8 to 10 folks who identified as having low vision. And we just spent a few hours just learning from each other, with each other, about how everyone uses technology. And it was really exciting to see people sharing their different technology solutions with each other. So some people were using high contrast mode. Other folks were using screen magnification. Some were bolding their font. There was so many different combinations of settings that you could do to make your products work well for you. And for me, that was pretty early in my accessibility career, and it was really illuminating to see there isn't a single solution that works for everyone. Everyone has their own kind of tailored solution. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, are some of the more tailored solutions that we can find for accessibility if we're working with a learner, an older adult, someone with a disability, and we want to help them with technology. So with that, let's jump into digital accessibility. Has anyone seen this, what is called a persona spectrum? So this is a really useful tool created by Microsoft's inclusive design team. They call it the persona spectrum. And it's kind of a spectrum of people to think about when you're thinking about disability, because disability is not a binary thing of someone either has it or they don't. Disabilities can be permanent, and that's kind of what this first column is here, temporary or situational. So thinking about touch, for instance, a permanent disability, maybe that someone only has one arm, either they were born with one arm or they lost an arm throughout their life, and now they are navigating the world with one arm, navigating a world that is kind of built for people with two arms. They could have a temporary disability of maybe they broke their arm or they have a routine stress injury like carpal tunnel, and so they're looking for technology that can kind of help them navigate through life as they're navigating this temporary disability. Or they may just have a situational impairment. I love this drawing of a new parent, someone who's carrying a baby or someone who's multitasking and they have their phone in one hand and a coffee in the other, and you know, they're just trying to get things done quickly. So I really love this Microsoft Inclusive Design persona spectrum, because the idea is that we can come up with solutions that work for people across this spectrum. In sight, for instance, there's someone who's blind, someone who has cataracts, or a distracted driver. In hearing, we have a permanent disability would be someone who's deaf. You could have a temporary ear infection, or you could just be in a really loud place. Or you could be on the train and forgot your headphones and you want to watch something, but you don't want anyone to hear what you're watching. And then speaking nonverbal, laryngitis, heavy accent. So I really like to look at this when I'm thinking about accessibility, especially because, and this is something that comes up a lot at the Senior Center, is many people are somewhere in this spectrum, but don't really want to admit it. They might be embarrassed. They might be, you know, especially as they're getting older, they might be experiencing changes to their body, to their mind, and not really want to admit it yet. or they might just not think of themselves as having a disability. But we want to make sure that we're providing tools to help them use technology as easily as possible for them, and achieve their goals. And I loved what Maricela was saying earlier about like using technology isn't just about, you know, getting things done, it's about having fun, right? So how do we make technology enjoyable for everyone? So we'll talk about this through kind of 3 dimensions, starting with sight. We'll go through sight, we'll talk a little bit about touch, and also cognitive accessibility. And around sight, I think 3 of the things that I see the most, and again, going back to learning from our communities, the things that I see the most over my time volunteering is a lot of eye strain, people having trouble with text legibility, and folks experiencing vision loss, especially as they get older. So how can we help folks with these things? So for eye strain, I think a lot of us are familiar with the display settings that exist. We can enable dark mode, both on iOS and Android. You can set it up to turn on automatically depending on the time of day, or you can turn on dark mode all the time. There are many seniors I work with who are like, I just like to use my iPad while lying in bed. And like for those folks, I always recommend that they turn on dark mode so that they're not staring at this huge bright screen. So dark mode and then auto brightness and a few of these other types of display changes can really be helpful for reducing eye strain. When it comes to legibility, this is one where I think it can, there's kind of a spectrum of changes that you can make on your device. And so with each person I work with, I like to start with the simplest set of options and then scale it up depending on what they need. So the simplest set of options, and if you've explored your phone, you've probably seen that there's a whole accessibility section in the settings. That can be really overwhelming for people because there's a lot of really nuanced stuff there. So I always like to start in display settings. So in our display settings, here we have iOS display settings. You can see there are a few things that you can just, so this is in the, you go to the settings app and then tap on display and text size, or in Android, you would go to the settings app and tap on display. And there's just a bunch of kind of top level display options that can really enhance the experience for users. And I found that a lot of the seniors I work with, just turning on these few things really help them see their screen better. So the first is just turning on bold text, and you can see the difference between this first slide and the second slide. Bold text helps a lot because, you know, I've seen this working in tech. A lot of tech companies like to have these very thin fonts. So just making it bolder can make a huge wave of difference. There's also options to increase contrast. That's what I've done on this third slide here. That'll just make things pop a little bit more. And then setting large text can be really helpful as well. So there are these font size sliders both on iOS and Android. Those are the 3 things that I always recommend, is just start in display settings. There are a lot of options in accessibility settings, but it can be overwhelming. I will say that one thing that I've noticed a lot of seniors have done is sometimes go too large with the text. They make the text so large that it results in some layout issues with the UI. And I tried to find a good example of this. I couldn't find, I was really trying to find an example of, I've seen where if you increase your font size super, super large, sometimes it'll actually hide buttons on the screen. So I'll be working with someone and I'll be like, oh, you want to press the back button. And it's just not there because some other text has overridden it. But even if you look at, here's a screenshot I took from Twitter with a post from Community Tech Network. But if you look at this screenshot, you'll see I've got my really big text here, but then I have really tiny icons. And so even though the text is legible, because I've just increased the text, it almost makes the icons even harder to use because they're just so tiny by comparison. So a lot of apps, unfortunately, don't handle super large text well and result in this kind of layout shift. that obscures or complicates the hierarchy of controls. So if you're working with someone for whom like a little bit of large text is not really cutting it to help them see their UIs clearly, that might be a time to switch away from settings and move into assistive technology. So instead of using just the basic design display settings, going into accessibility settings and turning on screen magnification. This has a big learning curve, but it's something that can really, really help people, especially on smaller devices. And I'm showing iOS here, but it's the same on Android, of this ability to really zoom in and see things more clearly. I also like to call it, technically it's called zoom on the iPhone, but I like to call it screen magnification because Zoom has now been co-opted by, you know, by video chat. So that can confuse people if we're talking about Zoom. So screen magnification, I think, is kind of the next step up for that greater legibility. I kind of threw this into a rough matrix of I like to think about these settings as there's on one, it's a 4-quadrant graph here. On one side, there's like kind of set and forget. You set something and it just works. On the other end of that spectrum is constant usage of something. So usually like an assistive technology tool that you use every day. Then the other axis here is kind of, I initially had it called small learning curve, large learning curve, but sometimes it's not necessarily a learning curve. Sometimes it's also, it's not just about learning, but also about just like the amount of setup that needs to happen. It can just be difficult. So thinking about tools for enhancing sight on an iPad or Android device, the general display settings, I would say, is where we should always start. It's easy to set and forget and can have a huge impact. Then moving into the accessibility display settings where you can get really nuanced. That usually allows you to, again, make your text even larger, to change all sorts of things. Those are easy settings to explore. And then if someone needs something a little bit more advanced, that's when voice dictation can also come into play. Instead of having to navigate around visually, you can speak to your phone and tell it to send messages rather than you having to tap through a million things to do it yourself. Screen magnification, as I mentioned, and then screen readers are also very powerful, but a huge learning curve, because that when you turn on a screen reader, which reads out the content of the page to you, it also changes all of the gestures on your device. So it's a huge learning curve, but very useful, especially if someone has completely lost or lost most of their vision. We'll talk a little bit about touch. So touch, this is an area where I see people increasingly having challenges navigating, especially on touch screens. The largest issues that I see folks struggling with is precision. So, trying to tap on one thing and actually tapping on something else. Tactility, a lot of folks have difficulty with just using a touch screen. The fact that it isn't as tactile as, say, a phone with buttons on it can be very challenging. Timing and gestures, which I kind of lump together as also similar to precision, of your device is expecting you to interact with something in a certain way. And maybe you're trying to do it that way, but you don't do it quite as quickly as it expects, where your gesture comes from the upper right instead of the upper middle, and the device doesn't understand what you're doing. I see this a lot when I work with folks, and it's really frustrating to see because you would expect the technology to be more forgiving, more lenient, but a lot of times it's very, very rigid, and then people get really frustrated with themselves when I really think they shouldn't, because it's not your, often if you're having trouble, pretty much always when you're having trouble using a device, it's not your fault. It's something about the device that is unnecessarily complicated. So this is an area where I really, again, really like to kind of see how people are interacting with their device so I can recommend solutions for them based on their particular needs. So when we talk about precision and tactility, like by and large, the top assistive technology that I've seen for interacting with touchscreens is a stylus. I know one thing I love is that a lot of the nonprofits around San Francisco like hand out stylus pens. Yeah, Audrey just went in and said, we typically provide CTN branded stylus pens for our cohorts. Very helpful tool. I totally agree. You can't underestimate the power of a stylus. It just is a much smaller element than your finger, so you can get a lot more precise. In the tech industry, we have standards around making sure that tap targets are large enough for like the average human finger, but a lot of times companies don't follow those. So the stylus really helps with that precision, and it also helps you see what you're tapping on. And I didn't mention in the last section, but some of those display settings on your devices can also, if you dig really deep into those settings, there are ones where you can say, show me the shapes of buttons, which can be really helpful because it'll give a bounding box around buttons. So it's much clearer of where you need to tap, especially when there's just this copious white space and you're not sure. So by far, stylus is the best assistive technology I've found, and the easiest one to kind of access and carry around. Similarly, having external mouse and keyboard, I found a lot of people have trouble using the on-screen keyboard, especially on mobile devices like an Android phone, an iPhone, because it's so small. So having an external mouse or external keyboard can really help with those things. Physical buttons as well. So you're probably familiar, with iPads used to have this home button on them that a lot of people found really useful. And in kind of streamlining their devices, they got rid of the home button and it's all gesture based. And it's a little bit harder for folks to use now, I think. So Apple at least has this feature called Assistive Touch, which you can access through the accessibility settings. And Assistive Touch is this really powerful button. It looks like this little white button that kind of hovers on top of your screen, and you can configure it to do whatever you want it to do. So in some ways, it can be a very overwhelming accessibility tool. But the way that I like to ease people into it is just setting it up so that all it does is if you tap on it, it acts like the home button on the iPad or the iPhone. This is especially useful, I think, cognitively as well. Sometimes people are confused about what app they're in. They're just like deep in a process and not sure how to get back to the beginning or how to get back to their home screen. Especially on a device that doesn't have that home button, being able to just press that button on the screen and it shows up anywhere on the screen to take you back to home, to take you back to this clean state is really, really helpful. So Assistive Touch, you can configure it to, here I have a screenshot of the configuration screen where single tap is set up to access home, but you could also set it up to do other things, like if gestures are really difficult for you to do, like a swipe gesture, you could set it up to do a swipe gesture with the press of 2 buttons. So it's a really powerful tool, but also huge learning curve for getting it to kind of do all those different things. So I like to start small, single tap for the home button. In addition to Assistive Touch, there's also a bunch of other, again, nested deep in these accessibility settings, ways to make touch a little bit easier for you. I recently found this setting that I wasn't familiar with, and I'd like to try it with some folks. Under touch accommodations, this thing called Tap Assistant, where you can actually configure it to, instead of just tapping once on something, you could put your finger down on the screen and move it to where you need it to go, and then let go, and it would consider it a single tap. And this I really want to try with folks because I've had a number of people who I work with who just trying to tap on a button will tap a little bit above it or a little bit below it. and then we'll have to try again and try again, and it can be really frustrating. And so this thing, and I literally just tried it yesterday. I was really excited about it. With this configured, I tapped on my screen and it actually shows me it kind of highlights the area that I've tapped. It shows me where I'm dragging to. And so it's a really useful feature. But again, it's something that's a little bit varied. And something that I've learned about these accessibility settings is there are so many. And if you ask someone to just go in and find what works for them, it can be very overwhelming. If you ask someone who works in accessibility for a living, and there's always new stuff. So this sounds super cheesy, but like another tool at our disposal is just curiosity. Having curiosity, having patience. The way, I don't know how you all work with your communities, but when I work with seniors at the senior center, I'm always like, I don't know, like if I don't know a thing, I'm like, I don't know it, but let's figure it out together. Let's find out how it works together, and we'll both learn something new. A lot of this is kind of trial and error to figure out what works best for an individual, what doesn't work very well for that individual. So this is another graph here around just some of the tools that exist around touch. I didn't mention, but I could have mentioned voice dictation again comes up as a really useful tool for touch. Instead of having to navigate around and tap on all these little buttons, you could just tell your phone to send an email to someone, and that'll save you a lot of time. But yeah, I think the basic assistive touch on Apple devices of just having that home button that assistive touch button that functions like a home button can be really helpful. Small learning curve. And then there's so many other things you can customize depending on if someone has tremors, if someone has carpal tunnel. There are a lot of different settings you can do to really customize to an individual's needs. And finally, I wanted to talk about cognitive accessibility, which interestingly enough is not on Microsoft's persona spectrum, even though they have a whole detailed website about inclusive design for cognitive accessibility. And this is a tough area, especially because things that work for someone might be detrimental to someone else. Like a tool reads text aloud to you, may be overwhelming to one person, but really helpful to another person. But some areas I wanted to briefly touch on around cognitive accessibility: spelling, understanding icons, and memorizing steps. So spelling, the two tools that I think are really useful here are predictive text and, again, voice dictation. I've noticed with a lot of seniors, especially those for whom English is a second language, they have a lot of anxiety about spelling things right. They just want to be able to look up something on YouTube so they can watch a fun video, and I can see them hesitating, especially when typing in front of a tutor, because they don't want to type something incorrectly. So predictive text, which is built into pretty much every handheld device now, is really useful. If you start typing and then it shows you, it predicts what you want to say, and you can just tap on that. So I have been, when working with people, I've been helping them see, as they start to type a complicated word, I'm like, there it is right there. You can just tap it and it'll populate it for you and you can move on. So predictive text, again, super wonderful. And the same with voice dictation. Like voice dictation, I think, is one of the greatest kind of advancements in technology in recent years, because it really helps across the spectrum. I mentioned it in terms of sight. If you're having just trouble navigating your interface, you can tell your computer what to do. You can ask your computer to set a timer for you when you're cooking, so you don't have to, take your hands away from what you're cooking. You can also use voice dictation to write emails. I've been helping a few folks lately get comfortable with voice dictation so that they can easily write emails to people, write notes to themselves, and save that time of having, especially to hunt and peck for characters on the keyboard. There is always the caveat around voice dictation software is still it's still learning voices, right? And it sometimes is really bad with accents, which is awful, right? So it can also be a very frustrating experience for some people of trying to use this software and the technology not understanding them. So that's something to keep in mind. Sometimes voice dictation isn't the right tool for someone, but it's worth trying. So I wanted to talk also about iconography, and this is one where I actually don't have great advice here um, about how do we make iconography more accessible, or what tools can an individual user use to make iconography more accessible? I do think in some cases voice dictation could help because, and I have on the screen here all these different arrow icons that I drew. Like they all mean different things. One of them means reply all, one means refresh, they all mean a million different things. And it can be really complicated. Sometimes they mean something different in different apps. And that can be scary, especially when most of these are actions, and if you tap it, there may not be an undo. So voice dictation can help a little bit, right? You could ask your device to send an email for you rather than you finding the right arrow to send it from. Another exercise that I do with folks is just really visualizing what is that item meant to represent in the real world? These aren't great examples here, but when you see the paper airplane icon, talking about that's supposed to be a paper airplane, and what do you do with that? You send it over to someone else. So sometimes just kind of talking through what does this icon represent in the real world can help folks figure out what it means. And then my like super advanced hack, which I use sometimes when I'm like, I have no idea what this icon means. I'll turn on the screen reader on my phone and have it read to me what the developers called that particular icon. But that's a super advanced thing that I wouldn't expect people to do. And it's actually kind of interesting in that sometimes people using screen readers can have a better experience than folks looking at app visually just because of things like these icons. So this is something where I'd love to know from other people, how do you help people navigate this space? On my end and the tech industry side, I just work really closely with designers on figuring out ways to make these icons more accessible. So having text next to them or on things where you can hover, having tooltips so that there's always clarity about what the action is, especially for destructive actions or things that send something to another, that send things away from your device. I personally think there needs to be some text there so that the user has confidence that they're doing the right thing. I envision a world in the future where you could basically tell your phone or your device what kind of visual UI you want, or what kind of, maybe it isn't even visual, but just what kind of experience you want. And it will show that information and actions to you in the way that makes the most sense to you. So I see us going in a very like tailored way for technology, which is exciting, but also in some ways scary, right? Because anytime that you have a lot of customization, that's a lot of overhead for someone who may not be familiar with technology. So it's always like a balance between customization, like flexibility, and like streamlining. I show this to tech people, but you may have the most helpful website ever, right? But if you have all these mountains in front of it, no one's going to be able to use it. And so we've talked a little bit today about some ways that people can customize their devices to maybe, and the equivalent I'll use of that is like hiking sticks, right? To like hike those mountains better. But the role of my industry, of the tech industry, is to really remove those obstacles, not even put them there in the first place, so that people can really access the most helpful stuff, and not just helpful, but fun. Going back to what Maricela was saying earlier, helpful and fun. So how do we do that? Microsoft is a leader in this space. They have an inclusive design toolkit that I forgot to put a link in the slide, but I'll send a link to Carla after, and Carla can hopefully send that out. But they have a beautiful toolkit that every company I've worked for has used as a model of how do we really approach inclusive design. And they approach it accessibility is part of this larger thing of inclusive design, of making experiences that work well for a variety of people and bringing them along in the design process. You're not designing in a silo, but you're working with the communities who you serve to really make sure that things work well for them. And I've seen a shift in the past like 10 years that I've been in this industry. It used to be that people were like, what is accessibility? And now people are asking more questions about how specifically can I make this experience more accessible? And so people are talking about how do we make things more accessible, not just like what is it and do we need to do it? So things are changing, and I'm hopeful. We'll see. We'll see. I'll just express gratitude again for all the work that you all are doing, just supporting our communities the way that you're doing, empowering people. It's really important work. So thank you all.